Welcome to Adversity to Ascension, a podcast that I hope will inspire you as we explore the ways that humans overcome setbacks, hardships, and seemingly devastating events to attain their goals and dreams. I'm your host, Dr. Sandra Cox. I'm a mother, a social justice warrior, and a board-certified psychiatrist with nearly 30 years of experience. And saying that makes me feel really old. But the practice of psychiatry has been rewarding and at times heartbreaking, but always inspiring. The stories that we psychiatrists hear are sometimes more incredible than any fiction writer could imagine. I've had the privilege of guiding many patients through their darkest, most vulnerable moments toward the light of a new life. But I'm only a guide. They're the ones who have to show up to do the work. And they do so driven by a yearning to heal and for freedom from the chains of the past. I'm always amazed and humbled by their courage and fortitude. The human spirit longs for freedom from emotional pain, yet that pain is necessary for growth. My work is done one patient at a time, and for many years, I wanted to find a way to make a more significant impact without the constraints of money or insurance or pharmaceuticals or 30-minute appointments. And I hope this podcast will make an impact on my listeners and that they can find inspiration to overcome the obstacles in their own lives. As I began to think about how to do this first episode, and my producers asked me to tell the story of my own life, it was as if my family gathered around me, the people that have gone before me, and they were all asking me to tell their stories. And I'm going to get tearful. I can't believe it. I grew up in a small rural community north of Kansas City, Missouri, and I was raised on a farm as essentially an only child because my brother was 15 years older than me. And by the time I was 3 years old, he was off to college. I spent my childhood riding my horses and wandering around in the woods and exploring nature because that was where I found solace from the torture of a tumultuous household. You see, although my parents, my examples of overcoming adversity, had really managed to overcome enormous hardships, they still carried crippling emotional wounds, and much of their lives were spent reacting to and from that pain. My mama was the third of 8 children, born in 1923 to a farmhand and a meek, petite woman who was God-fearing and did what she was told. Their meager lives often required them to go without enough food, existing on a diet of beans and whatever they could grow in a small garden, greens that they would pick from the woods, and occasional treat of ham hock or cornbread. The various houses they lived in on the farms where my grandfather worked had no running water, no heat. And my mama said that the snow would actually blow up through the floorboards in the wintertime. She had to share a bed with many of her siblings. The smaller ones would lie, crosswise across the bottom of the bed, and the older ones would lie lengthwise in the bed. They didn't have shoes in the summertime and only wore hand-me-downs in the wintertime. Many people don't know this, but in the 1930s, high school was not free. You had to pay tuition and buy your books to attend high school. As it was, high school was not going to be a possibility for my mama. But she was smart, and the superintendent of her school devised a plan to not just help her get through high school, but help her get out of the abject poverty that she lived in. He found a family for her to go and live with and work as their housemaid and their nanny in exchange for room and board and tuition and books. So, at the age of 13, she left home and left her family to go work as a domestic and attend high school. This wouldn't be the only family that she lived with. and some were mistreating her at times. But having a bed to sleep in that she didn't have to share with her siblings, and she got to go to high school, well, that meant a lot to her. She met my father at the age of 17, and he seemed like what women of that time would call a good provider. So when he asked her to marry him, she accepted, mainly to escape the bleak existence she was living. This decision would prove to be a painful one because she didn't realize how his own wounds would impact her life and those of her children. My father was born along the Mississippi River in northeast Missouri in 1918 with 2 club feet. His feet were so deformed that they wouldn't ever allow him to walk. But the family's rural doctor attempted to fix this anomaly, and he kind of botched it. In fact, he botched it horribly. So my grandparents packed up and took their baby boy to St. Louis in their horse-drawn buggy. There, doctors attempted to repair the damage that had been done to his tiny feet and his Achilles tendons that had been cut clear through by the other doctor. And they fitted him with iron braces. My grandmother would have to tighten those braces every night for the first 6 years of his life. And so his life began with physical and emotional pain that endured for the rest of his life. His beginnings could have been the recipe for a serial killer. Horrible pain being inflicted by his mother every day as she had to tighten those braces. As soon as the braces were removed, his parents put him to work on the farm. Because farm work was really hard, and that's often why people had children, so that they could have help on the farm. And even though he had a younger brother and sister, most of the work fell to him. He toiled every day. He walked behind a plow through dirt clods, often dreaming of a life that would not require him to be in pain. So he decided that farm life couldn't be his existence. He longed to get an education, but his father would hear nothing of it. At the age of 18, determined to make his dreams come true, he hitchhiked to the Hannibal LaGrange College without a cent in his pocket. The college had a farm, and my dad knew how to run one. So he talked to the dean and convinced him to let him run the college farm in exchange for an education. He'd get up well before dawn and go out and see to the farm animals and then rush to class, often not having time to change out of his overalls and his dirty boots. And his classmates would look down on him as he came in the classroom where they all sat in their suits and ties. But he worked hard, and he graduated and became a teacher. And then he met my mother. Together, they built a life from nothing. He later became an insurance agent, and my mother worked as a secretary. And they built businesses that helped them buy a small house in Kansas City, and eventually the farm where I would grow up. Throughout my brother's upbringing, although I wasn't there to see it, I was told that my father was frequently cruel and very violent toward him and our mother. By the time I was 3, as I said, my brother left home and we moved to the farm. My dad's rage continued and I became the new target. I remember getting on the floor, curled up in a ball, trying to minimize how much of my body would be exposed to his belt as he whipped me. I became small and meek. I learned to keep my mouth shut, to be seen and not heard. My mother was always depressed. No wonder, right? She was angry all of the time, and angry at me because I may have done or not done something, such as leaving my coat on the chair or not cleaning my room. And she interpreted that as something that I was purposefully doing to hurt her. I was always perplexed by that. Nothing I ever did was intended to hurt her, but I couldn't convince her of that. Throughout my childhood, my parents worked diligently to put my brother through college and medical school. Even though they fought with one another, they were determined to make a better life for my brother. And he completed his 4-year bachelor's degree in 3 years and graduated summa cum laude. When he went to medical school his first year, we went to visit him, and I was 6 years old. And he took me through the anatomy lab, riding on his shoulders. I wanted to get down, and I know that he was afraid that I would touch the cadavers, and I probably would have. But he became my idol. I wanted to be a doctor just like him. He also became another example of someone who had been determined to rise above the adversity he had grown up in. Despite the cruelty he'd endured, he became a successful oncologist and worked with Dr. E. Donald Thomas to develop bone marrow transplantation. Meanwhile, back at the farm, my father, who was already no doubt tormented by what we now call PTSD, but we didn't recognize it as that at the time, he had also developed bipolar disorder, and his manic highs went unchecked. He behaved very erratically, spending excessively, drinking to calm the mania, and becoming very rageful. The winter of my 15th year, he plummeted into a deep depression, and my mother caught him loading up the gun, preparing to kill himself. She was able to take the gun from him and take him to Kansas City, where he was admitted to a psychiatric ward. He received 10 electroconvulsive therapy treatments there. This was just enough to bring him out of his neurovegetative state and into a state of rage again. So he came back home, but he fell back into a depression and neglected his businesses, and the family financial situation really deteriorated. By the following winter, he was barely able to function. After a typical Missouri winter ice storm, he slipped and he fell and crushed his elbow, which required surgical repair. In the process of receiving a local anesthetic in his arm, he had a seizure. The next day, when I visited him in the hospital, he was like a new man. He was sitting up in his bed and smiling at me. It was years later, when I went through my psychiatry rotation in medical school, that I realized that this was the one last seizure that his brain needed to pull him out of the depression. But I digress. Throughout all of that, I desperately wanted to become a doctor, just like my brother. But my family was nearly destitute. All of their resources had been spent on putting my brother through school and on my father's manic spending sprees. So as soon as I graduated from high school, I found a job as a secretary for a large corporate law firm in Kansas City. And I reasoned that moving out of my parents' house would be the best thing for them because I'd no longer be a financial burden to them. But the dream of becoming a doctor never left me, and I'd spend my evenings with a small calculator and some paper and a pencil trying to figure out how I could afford to go to college, how I'd have to work and how many hours in order to pay for the tuition. And it became very clear that it just wasn't possible. That made me just really depressed. I just realized that college wasn't going to happen to me because, you see, I didn't know, believe it or not, that I could get student loans. No one in my tiny high school had bothered to tell me, and my parents didn't know either. So for 5 years, I worked as a secretary and a waitress and in retail, suffering the usual indignities of being a woman in a man's world in the late 1970s. I can't remember how, but when I found out I could get loans from the government to go to college, I was just like giddy with hope. I applied to take the entrance exam at the ripe old age of 23, and I was terrified. After all, I'd barely been using my brain for 5 years, and the education I'd received in my tiny little high school was questionable at best. So when I sat for the exam, I was surrounded by kids who were straight out of high schools from Kansas City and St. Louis, and they were all breezing through the exam because it was basically review for them. But I sat staring particularly at the math section like I was looking at a foreign language, because basically I was. Turned out I couldn't even guess higher than the 7th percentile. So I went home and I called my high school math teacher and asked him to please tutor me through the summer. And he did. And by the time I went to college in the fall, I was ready. My parents went with me to the orientation for pre-med students, and we listened to Dr. Bob Breitenbach, a biology professor with a reputation for being very, very tough. And he had been my brother's advisor in college. And Dr. Breitenbach lined out all 4 years on a whiteboard. And as he kept writing, I kept slipping lower and lower in my chair, filled with self-doubt and fear. I think my dad must have noticed because he leaned over and he whispered in my ear, "You're every bit as smart as your brother." And then he gave me a look that said, "You can do this." Because you see, despite his own emotional struggles, he wanted his kids to stand on his shoulders to be successful. And I came to see my parents as shining examples of people who overcame the challenges they were born into. They persevered and held on to their dreams and were selflessly determined that we would do better than they were able to. On the first day of biology class, in a hall with about 350 students, Dr. Breitenbach looked out over all of us and said, "Who out there are pre-med?" So we dutifully and excitedly raised our hands, proud to be pre-med students. And then he said, "It's my job to fail at least 50% of you." That was all I needed to hear. Because as far as I was concerned, it was on. I was going to show Breitenbach that I could make it. And I did. It wasn't easy. I worked really hard to catch up with all the knowledge that my classmates had gained from high school. And I graduated with high enough grades and an MCAT score that was good enough to be admitted to medical school. That was in a day when about 30% of medical students were women. The attendings were nearly all men. And when we did rounds, the attendings would shoot questions out to the group, hands would go up, and the attendings would look at all the men, but not at the women, as if we were invisible. That really pissed me off. So I stopped raising my hand and I started just blurting out the answers. I wasn't going to be passed over just because I was a woman. After graduation from medical school, I spent a brief period of time in OBGYN, which had been actually my dream, but it was really brutal. And I thought that it would probably wrench all of humanity out of me. So I switched to psychiatry, and I saw that as a more holistic approach to healing. And now I recognize that decision in part as an attempt to understand my family and my own psyche. Most healers are wounded, and study in psychiatry was an attempt to heal myself. I've never regretted that decision, though. My patients have been my teachers. They've shown me the strength of the human spirit. It's been and continues to be a privilege to assist them on their journeys and witness their struggles. Human resiliency is really fascinating and varied. On the surface, it's really hard to tell what makes the difference between someone who will be entirely ruined by a disastrous life event and someone who just goes on to survive and even thrive. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, Dr. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of 3 Nazi concentration camps, wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." And there's a poem by Rudyard Kipling called If. He calls triumph and disaster 2 imposters who should be treated just the same. This podcast will help you to learn to recognize and cultivate your own resiliency, your determination, and your hope that can propel you to success despite challenges. On each episode, I will interview people who have experienced tragedy and hardship, yet gone on to build meaningful lives. They won't necessarily be people you've heard of, which makes their stories even more relatable. You'll also learn about the teachings of great leaders in the areas of human consciousness, self-healing, and abundance manifestation, such as Dr. Wayne Dyer, Neville Goddard, Dr. Bruce Lipton, Michael Beckwith, Dr. Joe Dispenza, Esther Hicks, and others that I may come up with. Additionally, we will explore the science of neuroplasticity, which has become one of my favorite subjects. It's the study of how the brain changes in response to its environment. Our thoughts and our feelings can actually change the way our brain wires itself. And through those discussions, you'll learn how to change your brain and how it operates by changing your thoughts, emotions, and your feelings, setting off a chain of events that can change your future. So join me each week on your favorite podcast platform for an experience in inspiration, education, and hope.